He got his answer that evening, after Peter succeeded in arranging a private meeting with the general. As Peter approached the soldier guarding the path to the modest stone house that was Washington's headquarters, Har and Dela walked behind him, and Goran hovered above his head, all three magically concealed. The guard, who'd been leaning on his musket, suddenly straightened. "You may not pass." Peter smiled politely. "What is your name, Private?" The guard gulped, seeming to notice Peter's officer uniform for the first time. "Nathaniel Chapman, sir, of the 9th Massachusetts," he stammered. "Well, Private Chapman, I am General Muhlenberg, and I am expected," Peter replied. The guard was saved any need to reply when the door to the headquarters suddenly opened, revealing a black slave dressed in white livery. Har recognized Billy Lee, Washington's valet. Har had learned over the past 2 months that wherever Washington went, Lee was never far from his side. The slave stood impassively until Peter, Har, Dela, and Goran came through the door. "That will do, Billy," said Washington, who was seated at the head of a cluster of desks pushed together to form a large table in the front parlor. "Now, make sure we remain undisturbed." Billy Lee walked through the entrance and turned to pull the door closed behind him. As he did so, he caught Har's eye and gave the briefest of nods. "That makes 5, Har thought. Then he looked around the table. "Make that 6. Much to his surprise, he saw that he, Peter, and the other 2 fairies would not be meeting with Washington alone. The 2 tall Oneida visitors he'd seen earlier in the day were standing together on one side of the table, smiling at the newcomers. On the other side stood a young American officer whose name Har did not know. The young man was impeccably dressed, his uniform cleaned and pressed, his hair carefully groomed. He was looking intently at Har, Dela, and Goran as well. But unlike the Oneidas, the American officer wasn't smiling. His appraising look and shrewd expression made Har think of a fox preparing to pounce on a rabbit. "Am I the rabbit?" Washington cleared his throat and began the introductions. "General Muhlenberg, I trust you recall my aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton." "Indeed I do, sir," Peter replied, extending his hand. Hamilton shook it but kept his expression guarded. "General, it pleases me to see you again and to learn of your relationship with these, visitors." He swept his eyes over the fairies, then looked back at Peter. "General Muhlenberg," Washington continued, "may I present Chief Shenandoah and Polly Cooper, both of the Oneida Nation?" Peter nodded to both, and they returned the gesture. "Please allow me to introduce our other visitors, Goran, Dela, and Har," said Peter, motioning to each in turn. "Each serves as rangers for their respective peoples." "Which peoples are those, if I may ask?" said Chief Shenandoah, still smiling. Har spoke first. "I come from a dwarf colony named Gruneberg in Virginia. Peter and I have been friends for a long time, since his student days back in Germany." Peter chuckled and shook his head. "I wish you wouldn't keep reminding me of those days, Har." "As for me," said Dela, "my people are known back in Wales as the Gwragedd Annwn. We are a people of lake and river." "And what about you of the golden plumage?" asked Polly Cooper, her attention focused on the winged fairy. "I am a sylph of the Knob," Goran replied. "My folk are originally from Cornwall." Hamilton cocked an eyebrow. "A sylph, you say? I know that word. I've read my Paracelsus." Har saw Goran wince. "My folk are well acquainted with the human who went by that name," said the sylph. "I must confess I am not," said General Washington, a bit impatiently. "Paracelsus was a Swiss doctor who wrote a philosophical work linking the 4 classical elements of air, water, earth, and fire to 4 creatures with magical properties," Hamilton explained. "The sylphs, if I recall correctly, represented air. I believe Paracelsus would call you," he pointed to Dela, "an undine, and your other companion a gnome." Har bristled at the comparison. "I am not a gnome, sir. I am a dwarf." Hamilton looked taken aback at Har's vehemence and began a clumsy response, but the Oneida woman, Polly Cooper, cut it short with a screech of high-pitched laughter. "Well said, Master Dwarf.